Voice America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. Hope you had a great weekend, and certainly a lot going on, but we're going to start this first hour pretty much focusing on the need for critical thinking and biblical thinking in a society and culture that sometimes looks like they've lost their mind. Extremist ideas. In about a half an hour, I'm going to have Victoria Churchill on. She has been writing about extremist politics, and in particular, one particular candidate with some of the most bizarre things. And of course, we've mentioned in this program a few already, but we have one that is a doozy. Fortunately, did eventually lose in a runoff, but making statements that just are beyond the pale. And so we do kind of want to look at that issue for a while. Then, after we've kind of covered that for about an hour, next hour, we're going to be talking about this new film coming out called Young Washington, and I think you'll enjoy hearing from the writer. Of course, it's the early story of George Washington, just a very significant movie that has kind of a who's who of people that are in the film, and also just a great film to be coming out actually 4th of July weekend. So we will cover some of that and then cover a few other issues before this day is over. If you'd like to join us a little bit later, open up the phones. Of course, that's 1-800-351-1212. But I thought I'd start by kind of looking at it philosophically a little bit and then into the specific details. And this piece by Brian Gardner, he is an individual who is a legal scholar, but he also writes books and articles and things about grammar and thinking and logic. Might even be somebody we might want to get on the program sometime in the future. And he begins by talking about something we've mentioned before, because as a basis of education, he says the medieval trivium, that is grammar, logic, and rhetoric, was never thought to be superficial introductory. It was to train the mind to understand words, test inferences, and resist false persuasion. And so he then gives you 6 examples of why we need to have critical thinking skills. He refers to this, and it's our first article, which you can read if you would like. It has the title, Cooler Heads Must Relearn How to Prevail. When we are confronted by false ideas, conspiracy theories, really radical candidates, and we'll give you a pretty good list by the time this first hour is over, that is enough. But he doesn't look at candidates for the moment. We will when we talk with Victoria Churchill. But he uses a couple of examples. Number one, nuclear war. He says nuclear war is the clearest case. Deterrence asks frightened leaders to behave rationally when fear, pride, error, and time pressures are at their worst. I, of course, have a booklet we've done on a biblical point of view on nuclear war, and, of course, still a great and looming threat, even in light of course, this war with Iran. Number 2, the example he uses is pandemics. He says pandemics expose another weakness, our inability to feel invisible multiplication. That is, when we first heard about the COVID cases, I remember reporting at the time, well, we have just a few, so we'll see where it goes. Well, it multiplied rather dramatically. And the point is that then when you didn't know what you didn't know, there were all sorts of claims being made, oftentimes without any evidence, and we demanded certainty before action, he says, though certainty often arrives after action would have mattered most. And so, again, he recognizes that sometimes when we are faced with an imminent crisis, and the pandemic, the COVID lockdowns and everything are his second example. His third is one we talk about all the time. As a matter of fact, it's the latest issue of Outlook, artificial intelligence. He says artificial intelligence brings a newer temptation, seeing instant utility, and thus we infer safety. In other words, a lot of people use various AI techniques, AI apps, and they find they work pretty well. And so as a result, machine codes, summarizes, diagnoses, advises, and persuades. We call it progress, and yet, of course, we've been very concerned about what happens when it gets out of control. His fourth, again, one we talk about so often, climate change. By the way, isn't it interesting? We have a booklet on, of course, the issue of nuclear war. We have one on artificial intelligence. We have one on climate change. But here's the other one, again, where he says it really requires careful, dispassionate thought. We don't want to engage in some kind of reaction that says this is the end of the world as we know it, nor do we want to dismiss it either. And then in the process also talks about, while we're even just looking at the ecosystem, he says sometimes bad reasoning often leads to denial and doomsaying. Ecological collapses is oftentimes quiet, which makes it treacherous. We notice prices, markets, and quarterly returns. We neglect the living systems that make those abstractions possible. And then the sixth one he mentions, which is one we talk about so often here on Point of View, misinformation and polarization, something we're going to talk about in just a few minutes with our guests at the bottom of the hour, because these are corrosive, because people are no longer asking, is this true? But does this help my side? In other words, we get into some of the tribal actions, and so we say, well, if it helps my side, my tribe, then I will accept it. If it doesn't, I will reject it. And he says, if nothing else, it's important to actually dig a little deeper, ask more fundamental questions about that. And so finally he concludes by saying, look, these 6 dangers then don't merely challenge reason, they are enlarged by its failure. Nuclear war might arise from strategic vanity, pandemic spread through delayed compassion, unsafe AI advances through besotted inference, climate change is mishandled both by complacency and hysteria. Ecological collapse follows from false accounting, and misinformation spreads as a pernicious contagion. In each one of these, the mind isn't a spectator, it's part of the machinery. And so, if nothing else, he says these 6 dangers are the child, or the children, if you will, of defective reasoning. So, at the end he says, the answer isn't despair, nor is it blind faith in experts who can reason badly when fashion, funding, ideology, or ambition take command. The answer is disciplined humility. And if there's one thing that I hope that we will be for you, and we hopefully have a pretty good track record, is trying to be your trusted source for news and information. I lots of times will read things from individuals who I know I will disagree with, so that if nothing else, it can maybe check some of my bias, help me maybe hear some arguments that I'm not hearing from, quote, our side, and also really trying to check that kind of bias that almost all of us have. It's called confirmation bias. And so I hope that we will not only be your trusted source for news and information from a biblical point of view, but once again, might even bring Brian Gardner on and others to talk about the importance of critical thinking, evaluating things on the basis of their merit, and seeing whether or not those arguments stand the test of scrutiny, time, and reason. And that's just one more reason why, as we get into, as we'll talk about at the bottom of the hour, some of the most bizarre candidates that have actually been able to win primaries, and maybe people that you need to know about in the general election. We'll take a break. One more comment before we get to all that, right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Biblical archaeology seems to be going through a golden age of apologetics. One illustration is the fact that over the last 2 months I've had the privilege of interviewing 3 authors on their newest books about archaeology. Dr. Paul Weaver was on my radio program to talk about his new book, Faith-Affirming Findings. It deals with 50 archaeological discoveries that validate the historicity and reliability of the Bible. Jericho is regarded as one of the oldest cities in the ancient world. The location of the site, as well as the archaeological details, affirm historical reliability of the Old Testament. The discovery of Solomon's fortified cities affirm the location described in the Bible, and the form of the gates indicate that they were designed and built by one king. Hezekiah's tunnel was discovered in the 19th century and testifies to the history recorded in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. Archaeologists theorize that it should point to the ancient Pool of Siloam. This pool was only discovered by accident in 2004. This confirms the Old Testament statements about it, but it also points to the miracle Jesus performed on the blind man who was able to wash his eyes in the Pool of Siloam. While we're talking about the New Testament, we have the synagogue in Capernaum, a limestone synagogue constructed on the first-century basalt stone and the home of Peter. He also has a chapter on the Jesus boat, which was discovered in the mud and reconstructed. This first-century fishing boat provides a glimpse of the type of boats described in all the Gospels. On my program, I praised him and his publisher for including so many color photographs. I'm sure that Bible colleges and seminaries will be using the book, but it is readable for the lay person. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, for just a few minutes, go to a second column, which I think, again, is a great setup for some of the conversation we're going to have with Victoria Churchill about this whole idea of extremist politics and some of these incredible statements being made by candidates and even by Democratic leadership. Of course, Democrats have been threatening that if they are able to win the House or the Senate or the House and Senate, and of course even eventually the Oval Office, the White House, threatened to prosecute Donald Trump, talked about prosecuting ICE, putting people in jail and the rest, but some of the things you're going to hear in just a few minutes from this one particular candidate, even beyond the pale, which is even more significant. And it illustrates perhaps something I like to communicate to some of my younger listeners. It wasn't always like this. And one way to maybe make the case is to go to this piece by Michael Brown. Now, if you first start reading it, you think that he's actually speaking out against setting dates for the second coming. By the way, I might just as a program note that on Wednesday in our second hour, we're going to have Gary Frazier, oftentimes talks about prophecy. And I love the fact that he doesn't set dates, but he does bring a kind of a rational look to what is happening in the Middle East. He's probably traveled to Israel more than anybody else I know. An individual that has certainly studied prophecy and been one of the speakers with a lot of the well-known prophecy teachers. But nevertheless, Michael Brown reminds us that when he became a Christian back in the early 1970s, there were all sorts of people talking about the return of the Lord. And, of course, you had a book by Hal Lindsey called The Late Great Planet Earth. And, of course, there was a sense of excitement at the time. But then over time, what he began to see is all these false date setting. For example, there was this best-selling book, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. Well, I remember that only so well. 2 years before, Marlon Maddox had asked me to be a guest host on Point of View. We were in a studio very far away from where this one is, and we did not have any security. So one of the people that was part of the belief that the rapture was going to take place, September 12th, 1988, burst into the studio, and Marlon and I were doing a live broadcast. And after that point of time, they decided they might put some security in the doors so that wouldn't happen again. Well, anyway, when a friend asked him at the time, would he read the book, he said, no, I'll read it September 13th. In other words, the day after when the rapture was supposed to take place. Then he talks about Harold Camping. You might remember in 2011 said that Jesus was going to return on May 21st. Of course, that didn't happen. He had somebody else saying that the second coming was going to take place on September 23rd or 24th, 2025 during Rosh Hashanah. And he even posted a video back then, I remember it, on September 18th, 2025, why Jesus is not returning September 23rd. So, enough of the date setting. But he has occasionally had people say, but don't you think this is different? And he says, well, we've had times in which people have thought, and you go through, Caesar was the Antichrist, Hitler was the Antichrist, whatever. And there are times when people were convinced that they were on the very edge of the return of Christ. There's a lot of reason to believe that might be even now. But as he points out, it's possible Jesus would not return for another 100 years. But he does accept at least possibly some things that are different. And that's the point I want to make, not about date setting. He points to a couple of things. One that I'll just mention in passing because we've already talked about it, and that is artificial intelligence. If you haven't read our particular resources on that, it's our Outlook magazine. Of course, I have a booklet on that as well. And he says the growth of AI has given rise to some very plausible doom and gloom predictions. And I think we would understand that. And even people working in the field have raised some of those issues. But he says there's something else, and this is where I want to focus our time and attention on something that really is unprecedented in our lifetime, and that is what he calls the virulent and violent anti-Semitism that we're seeing today. Yes, we've always had anti-Semitism. Yes, there were times in which Christians, in the broadest sense of the word, or ecclesiastical institutions were persecuting Jewish people. There, of course, is the Holocaust and all sorts of other things that took place in Germany. But he says something is a little different, and that is what he calls this litany of the latest violent attacks on Jews in America, in England, in Australia, and other places around the world. He says social media influencers with millions of followers openly praise Hitler or express their fervent desire to see Jews suffer and die, and the news of the slaughter of Jews results in an orgy of online hatred with calls for more Jews to die. And one of the reasons why, even though we had a booklet on a biblical point of view on anti-Semitism that I did 5 or 6 years ago, I created a new one after 2023 because of all the people marching in the streets praising Hamas and making all sorts of justifications for the slaughter of innocent Jewish people in Israel. And so, again, what he says is that this is something that is very new and is very concerning to him. And he says, you might then ask the question, so what does this have to do with the return of Jesus? And he says, look, perhaps nothing, although it is urgent that we wake up and push back against this ideological cancer, because he says, on the other hand, the Bible predicts a day when all nations will gather together to wage war against Jerusalem and the Jewish people living there. It gives you quotes from Zechariah 12 and Zechariah 14, and you might want to read those passages and even follow his piece that we've posted. In just a minute, of course, I'm going to be talking about one of these particular candidates that actually was demanding that we build internment camps for people that support the Jewish people, what she refers to as American Zionists. Now, there have always been crazy people running for office. Believe me, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I can tell you stories of individuals that were communist candidates and libertarian candidates and anti-Semitic candidates, and none of them even got even 1% of the vote. But we're talking in this case about an individual that made it to the runoff and actually got more votes than the establishment Democratic candidate, eventually lost in the primary. But I think it illustrates again, we are starting to see some virulence and some extremism that should concern all of us. Now, there's some very good reasons for it. I think Victoria has some. I have some. And we'll open up the phones to get some of your comments as well. But it does seem to me that we're living in a time of extremist politics. We're living in a time in which people are evaluating various candidates and political policies and all the rest based upon their tribe. And that's why I posted this first piece here by Brian Gardner about the need for cooler heads to prevail. So we'll get into that in just a few minutes, but just as we're going to a break, let me mention that we have posted these two articles for you to read. Also the one by Victoria Churchill out of the Daily Mail, and I'll also pull some from our good friend Gary Bauer that gives you a couple more examples. And as a matter of fact, I've seen a couple of very good pieces coming out in the last couple of days about these extremist candidates. So I'm thinking we'll be talking about this between now and November, but we wanted to focus some time and attention on it today. But just before before we take a break, let me also mention that my Viewpoints commentary is there, and it is based upon an interview I did about 10 days ago with a good friend, Dr. Paul Weaver, on his book, Faith Affirming Findings. Now, this book is one that I'm very excited about. Disclaimer, I actually did an endorsement of the book as well. But the book actually has 50 archaeological discoveries that validate the historicity and reliability of the Bible. And so whether it's the historical accuracy of what we found in Jericho, whether it's the fortified cities under Solomon, whether it's Hezekiah's tunnel, the finding of the Pool of Siloam, for example, even in the New Testament, of course, having those of you that have gone to Israel going to the synagogue at Capernaum, which is actually the limestone synagogue based upon the first century one that Jesus was in, the home of Peter, the Jesus boat, all sorts of other things. This is a resource that I found to be very helpful. If you have somebody that's going off to Bible college, it might be the kind of book that they will have as a textbook. I suspect it'll be used in seminaries. Matter of fact, if you have any influence in your local Christian school, it's a book I would highly recommend as well. Very readable, and just once again pointing to all the historical evidence that we have for the historicity and reliability of the Bible. And you've heard me say before that in some respects I feel like we're even going through this golden age of apologetics. We have so much more evidence coming for our faith, whether it's in science, whether it's in history, whether it's in archaeology. So if you'd like to know more about the book or even listen to the interview I did about 10 days ago, go to the website pointofview.net. We'll be back with more right after this.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Now we're going to talk about the subject of extremist politics. Of course, we've already talked about the need for cooler heads to prevail, having good critical thinking skills. We've also talked about the rise of anti-Semitism and many other examples. And we now come to a very good piece that was co-written by Victoria Churchill, who is a U.S. political reporter at the Daily Mail. You may have also seen her on things like Fox News and Newsmax and Sky News and CBN. Also, she's had some of her articles appear not only in the Daily Mail, but Washington Examiner, as well as Real Clear Politics. And Victoria, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me. Always great to be back with you.
Always good to hear from you. And this one is a head shaker because for most of our listeners, they may be hearing about this for the first time, even in the state of Texas. And we are broadcasting right now from the state of Texas. Most people had not heard of this. And when I tell them, they are convinced that this is Babylon Bee. This is the Onion. But tell us the story of an individual by the name of Maureen Galindo, who I've already mentioned made it to the runoff, but eventually lost in the runoff. But the fact that you made it there tells us everything about what seems to be happening right near in the American political system. But tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. So Galindo is somebody that I covered during her runoff in my work for the Daily Mail. We uncovered some very interesting things about her past. First off, she had she had a business that was marketed as a tarot kink business. And she really tried to cover that up by saying that she was a psychologist. We kind of went through records and figured out that in Texas, you have to have a PhD to be a registered psychologist, which she only has a master's degree. And so kind of when you go on her business website, she actually lists her actual certification, which she has, which is a licensed marriage and family therapist, which is not quite the same as a psychologist, particularly in the state of Texas. And kind of outside of that, she's also made some quite disturbing anti-Semitic remarks as well. But, you know, even though she's lost the sentiment that she carries, we're seeing play out not only in Texas, but also in plenty of Democrat primaries, both with candidates and with voters all over the country.
Let me just mention that one of the things she said is she would like to turn the ICE detention center, the Carnes ICE detention center, into a prison for American Zionists and for former ICE officers, because they will then be accused of human trafficking. She also talked about castration and a variety of other things. These are individuals, and I'll just use her as one example of many others, that when I was growing up, and I'm older, so I can probably give a little more of a long-range history, we occasionally, I remember when my father ran for the California Assembly and growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, we saw some pretty unusual candidates who said some pretty outrageous things. They never got more than a fraction of a percent or maybe 1% of the vote. This is an individual, Maureen Galindo, that actually got more votes than the one that the Democratic establishment endorsed, just now lost, of course, in the runoff. But this is amazing that you're making these kinds of statements, that you want to put somebody who supports Jewish people or supports Israel into a detention center, and then you get more than 20% of the vote. What about that?
Well, absolutely. And, you know, I mentioned that this sentiment is something that we're seeing not only in Texas, but also in other races across the country. You know, for example, tomorrow there's the primary in Maine, which I'm sure has reached listeners even in Texas, with, of course, Graham Plattner. He's the guy that covered up his Nazi tattoo. You know, I saw one interview floating around with a supporter of his where she was asked if a Nazi tattoo was not a disqualifying factor, if having one of the Star of David or of the Israeli flag was going to be disqualifying, and she said yes. And so, you know, I think that really goes to show where not all, but a segment of the Democrat electorate is in this country.
Yes, well, again, we have listeners in Maine, and they'll get a chance to vote for or against Graham Plattner. Of course, he's in the Democratic primary, but it just illustrates again that we can begin to go across the country, and I'm starting to see more and more particular articles coming out talking about flawed candidates. And in the state of Texas, of course, we've had the conversation about the runoff there, but you can go to almost any state now, and you begin to see certain candidates who in the past wouldn't have even had a chance, and certainly if they had something in their past that we would consider to be disqualifying, that would be enough for them to step down, or for the party leadership to force them to step down, and yet those people are out there. Now, to give credit where credit is due, this Maureen Galindo did get enough visibility that Hakeem Jeffries said that vile speech has no place in Democratic politics, and I think AOC even made a comment. So in this particular case, they were willing to criticize her, but it has been amazing, as we talked about on our Friday weekend edition, that some very prominent Democratic leaders have traveled to Maine to actually endorse Graham Plattner or other individuals who, in many cases, they're going to overlook all sorts of issues about sexting and being abusive and all the rest, because they want to get those individuals in the Senate so they can take control of the Senate and do all the things that they've been promising their particular voters they wanted to do if they could once again win control of the House, the Senate, or even the White House.
Well, absolutely. You know, this is something that the Democrats have to look at themselves, how they're going to handle these kind of people being in their party, whether they embrace them or whether they distance themselves from them. You know, of course, you pointed out the comments made by Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader. But, you know, I think it's also interesting to see how these kinds of candidates are handled by people such as Chuck Schumer, right? He is the Senate Minority Leader, and he was asked by a bunch of reporters last week when he met with Graham Plattner here in Washington. You know, he was asked about all of his controversies, and he said he didn't go out and 100% endorse him, but he basically said, you know, he talked with Plattner and his goal is to beat Susan Collins. And so you really have to ask yourself, to what point does political expediency actually trump, you know, certain values that people might have? And of course, I think a big part of the kicker here is that Schumer is actually Jewish himself, right? And so, you know, he is willing to at least meet with and, you know, somewhat defend, even if it's not a full-throated endorsement, Graham Plattner, who, you know, of course, covered up that Nazi tattoo, who, you know, now he's claimed that he didn't know it was a Nazi tattoo. There's other people have come out and said that he did know, and he knew that, you know, he looked at it every single day for almost 20 years. I think 18 years was the amount of time that he had that tattoo before he covered it up when it became an issue in a political campaign.
Well, again, one of the things I did before you came is I was quoting from Michael Brown, who, of course, has had a great outreach over the years to the Jewish community with his own background, and talked about the fact, and I think this is fair, what he said is that the level of anti-Semitism we're seeing now is unprecedented. That was usually a deal breaker. If you were anti-Semitic and you were running in the Republican Party, you would be vilified, you would be removed, you would be spoken against, there would be everything to make sure that you didn't even get a platform. But on the Democratic side, there has been kind of a willingness to maybe turn a blind eye because some of the voters are, for example, of Arabic background or Muslim background. And now, of course, we're seeing it on the left and the right. We've talked about this on the program many times. And this whole issue of anti-Semitism, which surfaces whether you're talking about Maureen Galindo in the San Antonio area, or whether you're talking about Graham Plattner up there in Maine, you're talking about a level of almost acceptance of anti-Semitism that we haven't seen before. So let's take a break. When we come back, I thought for just a minute, since you're kind of a political commentator, we might say, has part of that happened because of the polarization of America? Sure. Has part of it also happened because of gerrymandering? Because indeed, you now have, in a sense, such safe districts for Republicans and Democrats, but we'll focus on Democrats for just a minute, that then if you're being elected, especially in the primary by your activists, they tend to be very much kind of hard left, and as a result, some of the kind of comments which would have been disqualifying in previous decades, you couldn't have gotten away with saying this in the past, but actually got you into a runoff in the primary. What has maybe changed in terms of some of the gerrymandering that has taken place, and even some of the tribalism. So if you would like to read this piece, because you probably still say, this doesn't even sound real, we again have the article, Daily Mail, one of the authors, Victoria Churchill, and we'll come back and talk with her right after this.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Continuing our conversation with Victoria Churchill for a few more minutes. And just again, think about this. Maureen Galindo got 1 out of every 4 votes in the Democratic primary here, eventually lost in the runoff. Next hour, I will talk about another case out of Oregon, and that's not a candidate, but a petition in which 720,000 people in Oregon signed a petition to put a ballot measure that would actually criminalize hunting and fishing, banning hunting and fishing. You only need 117,000, but look at this. Almost 750,000 people said, I think it'd be time to get rid of hunting and fishing in the state of Oregon. Again, don't think it's going to pass. But when you have at that level, Victoria, we're not talking about a few hundred people that are kind of bizarre, kind of periphery of society. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people in some of these races, tens of thousands in other races, who in the past wouldn't have even made it to a runoff and now are. And it does seem to me that it shows a level of polarization. And, of course, just a minute ago, maybe even with these gerrymandered districts, people are safe to say some things which before would have been disqualifying. Your thoughts?
Well, I also think that Texas's redistricting process, which you all went through just in the last year, actually goes to show that radical ideas can get out of general elections and kind of be outed at the primary, or I guess in this case, in the case of Galindo, the runoff level. In a district like the one that was created that Galindo was running in, they really had to make a case, the Democrats did, for electability in the general election. And so I think that goes to show the primary voters, if they are looking to take back a seat, or if they're running in a newly elected seat, if they're looking to impact majorities here in Washington. I'm coming to you doing this interview from the House Press Gallery right off the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. And so, of course, what happens in states like Texas and states all around the country, in districts like the one that Galindo was running in, is what's actually going to impact the majorities here. Of course, Republicans are working with narrow margins in the House and the Senate. Really, it seems like every week narrower and narrower margins, kind of depending on, who's out for certain elections and things like that. So sure. I think voters are smart, and they know that to actually make an impact here in Washington, they need to have candidates that can be successful in general elections. And I think that goes for both Democrats and Republicans.
Yes. What about the use of inflammatory language? Because that's another thing that you kind of addressed there as well. If you are in the midst of the pack and you want to get attention, certainly in social media, sometimes the most radical statements get made in part because then it attracts attention. And whether it was Jasmine Crockett or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in this case Maureen Galindo, whatever it might be, we sometimes seem to, Victoria, reward bad behavior, don't we?
I think social media definitely does. Social media, I think, is still the attention economy or the shock economy. But again, I also want to point out that voters are smart and they realize that social media is not real life. Another case that I'm sure you covered or have covered in the past in Texas was Valentina Gomez. She was somebody that's kind of this far right, fringe social media poster. She, burned the Quran on multiple occasions in videos that she posted on X and on Instagram. And she ran in Texas against a longtime incumbent in the 31st district. And, voters kind of saw right through that. They knew that they didn't want somebody who, she's actually from Missouri. She came down to Texas to kind of try and get a foothold in politics outside of just social media and actually try and have a real world impact. And the voters were kind of able to weed that out smartly, pretty much right off the bat.
Well, again, we're going to see more and more of those. Of course, another example, the other day we talked about, of course, the mayor of New York City, Zohran Mamdani, but just across the water there in New Jersey, 12th Congressional District, you have, of course, Adam Hamawi, who actually, when he won, shouted Allahu Akbar. And, of course, he's one that had worked in Gaza, if you might remember, and gave some interviews to the media saying he didn't see any weapons and there's no tunnels underground. Of course, that turned out not to be the case. So So I think the lesson here, Victoria, is voter beware. We say caveat emptor, buyer beware, voter beware. And it does seem to me that if anything, we need more moderating influences, more people saying, wait a minute, this person is beyond the pale. They do not deserve your vote. We need to go out and begin to speak out against some of the things that were said. And I'll give partial credit in this case to Hakeem Jeffries, at least speaking out against this woman. But in so many cases, there has been a willingness, both Republican leadership and especially with Democratic leadership, turning a blind eye to some things that should have been disqualifying in the past. And it just shows we're kind of in this new world. So if nothing else, that is a good lesson that we need to pass on to others. But just before we go, because we've been kind of following your career, what else is you working on? Because we'd love to have you back talking about some of the other things you've been noticing here in the political realm.
Well, thank you so much for that. As I mentioned earlier today, I'm sitting just outside the floor of the House of Representatives up on Capitol Hill, but I think as the campaign season progresses, I'll be covering more of the hot button races all around the country. So at least for the next few months, that's what I see my focus being. And, we'll definitely be sure to keep you and your audience abreast of the latest developments that I find out both on the campaign trail and here in Washington. Well,
again, if people want to find out more about you, of course, we have the article on Extremist Politics. We have a link to, of course, X and Facebook, and it's all available at the website pointofview.net. So thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me. Hope to be back soon.
We will do it again. Let me just mention real quickly that why is there such a push right now to try to win the House and to win the Senate? And our friend Gary Bauer put together the short list, and I'll just mention 6 things real quickly since we're coming to a break. Number 1, Democrats have been threatening to prosecute President Trump and anyone who worked in his administration. And so that is something where, again, if you get the end-of-day report, gives you a link to some of those statements. House Democrat leader Hakeem Jeffries, I mentioned just a minute ago, has threatened to prosecute federal immigration police, and there have been a number of Democratic prosecutors in various states or in various cities saying they wanted to do the same. Number 3, the focus on wanting to punish federal immigration police by banning them from having other jobs. There's multiple links to that as well. Number 4, the plan to eventually punish various companies that have worked with the Trump administration, and again, a couple of links to those statements being made. Then a number that have even talked about, and this one, of course, going nowhere, to ban conservatives from using the Internet, if you can believe that. And then finally, there's, of course, those that have said, and we'll get into this a little bit later with another piece that I have, of wanting to criminalize parents who refuse to embrace their child's gender preferences, and that gets us into the transgender issues. So if you think that this election isn't going to have an impact in the future, it has all the potential of doing so. And what I wanted to do today is, if nothing else, help you understand that, again, these are individuals who may not be elected, but if they wanted to be elected, certainly are making some pretty unbelievable statements, outrageous statements, statements that would have been enough to cause voters to turn away from them. They would have been disqualifying statements, and yet some of these individuals are putting petitions on the ballot, and in some cases making it all the way into a runoff election. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kirby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this.